The Equalizer is about a guy named Robert McCall who lives in Boston. He spends his days working at the Home Mart hardware store. Robert's just a regular guy leading an everyday life. While at work, he becomes friends with his co-worker, a chubby guy named Ralphie. Ralphie is trying to get in shape for the security officer selection exam. Robert gives Ralphie some advice on eating healthier by suggesting less carbs and more fiber. Robert is a very organized and disciplined person in everything he does. This man has a habit of timing everything he does using the seconds counter on his watch. In the evenings, he goes to a restaurant where he's a regular. He brings his own tea bags and utensils. He's also quite neat and tidy. He carefully arranges his napkins and utensils on the table, making sure everything is clean and in its proper place. The restaurant isn't too crowded that night, and there are only a few customers, including a lovely girl named Alina. Alina greeted Robert and asked about the story in the book he was reading. After a while, Alina said goodbye, called a taxi, and left. The next day, Robert went back to his usual routine. He went to work at Home Mart, had conversations with Ralphie and other coworkers, and then came home to tidy up. He had dinner, and that evening, he went back to his favorite diner with a book. When he arrived there, he noticed Alina entering the diner in revealing attire and lots of makeup. Alina was just about to order a drink when suddenly her cell phone rang, a call from her boss. Alina turns out to be a teenage prostitute who's working under the name Terry for the Russian mob, Slavy. That night, Alina was required to serve a customer who had picked up Alina in front of the diner. Over the phone, Alina tries to get away from her job and persuades Slavy not to have to serve the customer. As it turns out, the man often abuses Alina, but Slavy paid no heed to this and ordered Alina to immediately do her job. Slavy then reminds Alina that the girl owes him and threatens to kill her. Hearing the threat, Alina had no other choice but to obey Slavy's orders. Alina then left the diner and approached the man who had picked her up outside the diner, accompanied by Robert's inquiring glance which was directed at the girl. The next day, Robert was accompanying Ralphie, who was doing physical exercises to lose weight so that he could take the security officer selection exam. Even though Ralphie seemed to have a hard time and almost gave up because of the very heavy training portion, Robert continued to encourage the man and help him with all his heart so that Ralphie could fulfill his desire to become a security guard. Long story short, Robert went back to his usual activities, including visiting his regular restaurant and spending his time there reading books, where that night, Alina was already there first. Alina then walked over to Robert at the corner of her favorite table and asked him for permission before sitting there. Robert allowed Alina to sit and accompany him, after which he noticed bruises on Alina's beautiful face. After chatting for a while, Robert finds out that Alina is forced to work for Slavy because of debt, when in fact, the girl has a dream to become a famous singer. Alina then gave Robert a CD containing a recording of a song sung by her. Robert was very happy to receive the gift and promised the girl that he would listen. After spending time chatting casually at the diner, Robert then decided to take Alina home on foot. Along the way, they had quite an interesting conversation, until finally, a car stopped right in front of them. A man, who was none other than Slavy, got out of the car and went straight to Alina. Slavy then slapped and strangled Alina because the girl had disappointed her customer last night and demanded compensation from Slavy. Seeing this, Robert was about to help Alina, but Slavy then threatened him not to interfere. Slavy then gave a business card to Robert and asked the man to contact him if he needed a comfort woman. After that, Slavy took Alina away from there. In the following nights, Robert no longer saw Alina at his regular diner. One of the employees at the diner told Robert that Alina had been beaten by someone and was currently being treated at the hospital. Hearing this, Robert then went to the hospital and found Alina lying helpless with a face covered in bruises. A girl who is Alina's co-worker named Mandy then tells Robert that Alina has been beaten by Slavy for often rebelling and disobeying Slavy's orders. Seeing Alina's very poor condition and also suffering because she often received harsh treatment from customers and her pimp, Robert then became sorry and decided to help Alina get out of the problems and complicated situations she faced. The scene then switches and shows Slavy entering his fancy restaurant. Slavy then headed to his office, where several of his men had been waiting for the man's arrival to deposit some money from the people who owed Slavy. Not long after, Robert entered Slavy's office and offered the man some money to free Alina so that the girl would no longer have to work for Slavy. But the offer was immediately rejected by Slavy and said that he could make more money if Alina returned to work for him. Since Slavy refused his offer, Robert took the money back and walked towards the door. After being in front of the door, Robert did not immediately leave Slavy's office. The man instead locked the door and turned his body to face Slavy and his henchmen. For a while, Robert made a brief observation of the people in the room, as well as the items in there, where Robert estimated that it would take him only 16 seconds to kill everyone in the room. Slavey and all his henchmen were overthrown by Robert, who slaughtered them with a cold, expressionless face. But it was too late, since Slavey flatly refused Robert's offer at the start of their meeting. After that, Robert went home and went back to his usual activities on the following days. Robert had watched a broadcast on television that reported on the murder of Slavey and his henchmen, where the police concluded that the murder was due to a heated feud between gangs that often occurred. The scene then switches and shows a man named Teddy Renson, who has just landed in the United States and immediately rushed to the location of Slavey's murder. Slavey's boss, who is sent to investigate Slavey's murder and find the mastermind behind the murder. As a former member of the Russian secret police with special force training, Teddy could easily conclude that the person who had killed Slavey and his henchmen was not a random person, but rather someone who was trained to fight and kill. Meanwhile, Robert is shocked by the news of Ralphie's resignation. When Robert visited Ralphie at his residence, the man seemed to be helping his mother clean up his mother's shop, which was deliberately set on fire by corrupt police officers because her mother refused to give the security allowance. Because of this, Ralphie decided to quit his job at Home Mart and wanted to focus on helping his mother at the store. In the evening, Robert decides to help Ralphie, where the man secretly follows corrupt cops who collect security allowances from small business owners in Ralphie's area. Robert then recorded the actions of the corrupt policemen, then came to them and threatened to distribute the footage if they did not stop their actions. The corrupt cops had fought back, but Robert was stronger. After being beaten by Robert to a pulp, the corrupt policemen returned what they had taken from the residence and no longer carried out the act, because Ralphie's mother had received venture capital to renovate her shop and run her business again. Ralphie finally returned to work at Home Mart and continued his hard training and succeeded in realizing his desire to become a security officer. Elsewhere, Teddy seems to be interrogating gangsters who are often involved in business with Slavey, where Teddy does not hesitate to resort to violence to get the information he needs to find the mastermind behind Slavey's murder. With no results, Teddy then conducts an investigation with the prostitutes who are Slavey's subordinates, where Teddy finally finds out about Alina, who has had problems with Slavey recently. Teddy then goes to Mandy and urges the girl to reveal all the information about Alina and her rebellion to Slavey. Mandy then told Teddy about the black man who had come to visit Alina in the hospital. After that, Teddy kills Mandy. After receiving information from Mandy, Teddy immediately checked the CCTV cameras at the hospital and at the location of Slavey's murder, where Robert's figure was seen there even though it looked dim. One day, Robert is again faced with a situation where he is required to act quickly and incapacitate a man who is trying to rob a Home Mart cashier, who is none other than Robert's co-worker. Because at that time there were many visitors with children, Robert chose to grant the robber's wishes, including the gold ring that the cashier had. Robert let the man off the hook, but clearly remembered the license plate of the car the man was driving. Long story short, the next day, the female cashier was very surprised to find out that her ring, which was robbed yesterday, was suddenly in the cash register, and Robert was seen wiping the big hammer he used last night to knock out the robber and take back the ring. That night, surprisingly, Teddy comes to Robert's house and claims to be a police officer who is investigating the Slavey murder case. Teddy then asks about the whereabouts of Robert, who was in a fancy restaurant on the night of Slavey's murder. Robert, who had been trained to deal with the situation, then calmly answered all the questions asked by Teddy to avoid the man's suspicions. After asking Robert, Teddy said goodbye and left immediately. However, both Teddy and Robert both knew they had lied. Robert can already guess that Teddy is not a policeman, and Teddy concludes that Robert is the mastermind behind Slavey's murder. Knowing that the Russian Mafia is now after him, Robert immediately arranges a plan to leave his apartment. Long story short, Teddy orders one of his men to attack Robert at the diner, where Robert can easily knock out Teddy's men. Robert then exits the diner and finds Teddy in his car, where Robert then takes a picture of the man with his cell phone camera. Teddy and his men then chase Robert to his apartment, but they did not find the man there. While searching the apartment, intending to find a clue as to who Robert really is, Teddy finds nothing but drugs and torn sports tickets. On the other hand, Robert turns out to be somewhere else and watching the movements of Teddy and his henchmen through a hidden camera in his apartment. Knowing that he is dealing with one of the largest Russian criminal organizations in the world, Robert decides to visit his old friend and colleague at the Defense Intelligence Agency, Susan Palmer, who uses her resources to give Robert information about Vladimir Pushkin and his operations. Susan also informs Robert that Teddy Renson's real name is Nikolai Yachenko. After giving all the information that Robert wanted, Susan told her husband that Robert didn't ask for help, but he asked for permission to destroy Pushkin's operations in the United States. Robert first goes to Pushkin's cash vault, where Robert can easily incapacitate all of Pushkin's men, lock them all in the refrigerator, and then call the police and leave evidence in the form of a memory stick that loaded with information about Pushkin's illegal activities. In the evening, Teddy is seen having dinner at a fancy restaurant. In front of him appears a man who turns out to be a trained assassin, who was hired by Teddy to kill Robert. However, shortly after the man left Teddy's table, Robert then entered the restaurant and approached Teddy. Robert then sat there, handing Teddy the hitman's cracked and bloodied glasses. Robert then reveals that he already knows about Teddy's past and warns Teddy to stop pursuing him and pledging to bring down Pushkin's criminal enterprise. Later, Robert destroys oil tankers belonging to Pushkin and ultimately destroys Pushkin's entire business in the United States. After that, Teddy immediately set up a plan to immobilize Robert. Teddy and his henchmen go to the Home Mart store and take several of Robert's co-workers as hostages. After that, Robert received a threatening call from Teddy, who wanted him to come to the Home Mart store quickly. Robert was prepared for this situation and managed to sneak into the control room. From there, he used the loudspeaker system to create a distraction, keeping Teddy and his gang occupied. Robert defeated some of Teddy's men and then rescued Ralphie. He asked Ralphie to assist their co-workers in escaping through the back door to safety. Once Robert ensured that Ralphie and their co-workers were out of harm's way, he turned off the main lights in the Home Mart store, leaving only dim spotlights on. Robert took swift action and eliminated Teddy's men one by one using the tools available at the Home Mart store. He ultimately confronted Teddy and ended his life using a nail gun. 3 days later, Robert journeyed to Moscow, where he infiltrated Pushkin's mansion and eliminated all of his guards. Robert used his wit to trick Pushkin into electrocuting himself, putting an end to Pushkin's criminal operations. Upon his return to the United States, Alina, who had recovered from her injuries, approached Robert outside a grocery store. Alina shared that her life had taken a positive turn since breaking free from slavery. She expressed her gratitude to Robert for giving her a fresh start and gave him a gentle kiss on the cheek. The experience with Alina and her colleagues inspired Robert to continue using his abilities to assist those in need. In the evenings, Robert maintained his routine of visiting his favorite diner, but now he brought along not just a book but also a laptop. He used the laptop to post an online advertisement, now identifying himself as the Equalizer. The movie's moral is that, irrespective of our past or background, we hold the power to shape the kind of person we want to become in the future. Robert, utilizing his skills, chose to aid those in his community and help them overcome their challenges, driven solely by his sense of humanity and care for others.